50 men walked out into the Jordan Valley to look for a body. They searched for 3 days. Up into the dry hills above Jericho, where the limestone breaks into white shelves and the heat stands over the ground like something solid. Down along the riverbank, into the reeds and the tamarisk, into the ravines where a man might fall and not be seen. 50 trained men, sent at their own request, searching country they knew. They found nothing. And here is the part that should stop you. The Bible tells you about that search. It did not have to. The story was already finished, the prophet was gone, the successor had the mantle, the miracle had happened in front of a witness. The writer could have closed the scene there and moved on. Instead, he tells you that 50 men went out looking for a corpse and came back empty-handed and were told, "I told you not to go." Why would a book do that? If you grew up hearing this story, you were handed a picture, an old prophet in a rough cloak, a chariot of fire coming down out of the sky, the prophet climbing aboard, the horses turning, the whole burning thing rising into the clouds while a younger man watches from the riverbank. That picture is on church walls, it is in children's Bibles, it is in the hymn. And when you go back to the Hebrew and read what is actually written on the page, that is not what it says. Not quite. And the difference is not small. There are 2 men in the whole of the Hebrew Bible who do not die. Everyone else, the patriarchs, the kings, the prophets, Moses himself, everyone else gets a death notice. He died and was gathered to his people. He slept with his fathers. He was buried. 2 men do not get that sentence. One of them is Enoch, and he is gone in half a verse before the flood. The other is this man, and of those 2, only one of them was promised back. That promise is not buried in an obscure corner. It is the last thing the Old Testament says to you before the page turns to the Gospels. Behold, I will send you Elijah. And the reason a promise like that survives for 2,500 years, the reason it is still, tonight, physically enacted at a table you could walk into, with an empty cup nobody drinks from and an empty chair nobody sits in, has less to do with the chariot than with one Hebrew word, a legal argument that was never settled, and a body that 50 men could not find. If you want to walk through this with me, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next part of the story finds you, and leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. So let us go back to the beginning. To the day a man with no past walked out of the hills and told a king it was not going to rain. Part 1. The man with no beginning. Every major prophet in your Bible gets an entrance. Isaiah gets a year and a throne room and a burning coal. Jeremiah gets a father, a town, a priestly family, and a call scene where God touches his mouth. Ezekiel gets a date, a river, and 30 verses of wheels and fire before he says a word. Amos tells you what he did for a living. Even Jonah gets a father's name. Elijah gets 1 sentence. And then he is already talking to a king. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. That is the entrance. 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 1. No father, no mother, no tribe, no call narrative, no vision, no commissioning, no moment where God finds him. He is simply there in a throne room in front of the most powerful man in the northern kingdom, announcing a drought. And the one line of background the text does give you is broken. Here is something most people reading in English will never see. The phrase translated of the inhabitants of Gilead is genuinely difficult in Hebrew, and scholars have argued over it for a very long time. As the Masoretic text vowels it, the words read me Toshave Gilad, of the settlers or the sojourners of Gilead. A Toshav in Hebrew is a resident alien, a permanent outsider. someone living in a place that is not his by blood. That is the reading behind the King James. But the same consonants, pointed differently, read me Tishbe, from Tishbe, a place name, which would sit far more naturally beside the word right before it, Hartishbi, the Tishbite. The ancient Greek translators read it that way. They wrote out of Thesbon. A number of modern translations follow them. The scholarly text critical project that grades these decisions gives the place name reading a fairly confident rating, but notice what it does to the shape of the story. Whatever that phrase originally said, the man arrives from a place we cannot find, out of a region east of the Jordan that Israel always regarded as the edge of things. Either he is from a town that has vanished, or he is described as a resident alien in the land he came out of. Both readings say the same thing. He belongs to nowhere in particular. His name, though, his name is not vague at all. Eliyahu, Eli, my God. Yahu, a short form of the divine name. My God is Yahweh. In a kingdom where the queen has brought her father's god across the border from Tyre, where the king has built a temple to Baal in the capital, where the argument in the air is precisely whose god is the real one, a man walks into the palace, and his own name is the argument. He is a thesis statement, with a beard and a leather belt, and the first thing that thesis statement does is close the sky. Hold on to the strangeness of that entrance, because it comes back. A man who arrives with no genealogy, no birth, no beginning we are allowed to see. That is not usually how the Bible introduces people. And it is not, as it turns out, how this one leaves. Part 2, the ravens and the widow's jar. He announced a famine, and then God fed him from the beaks of scavengers. Get thee hence, and turn thee eastward, and hide thyself by the brook Cherith. So he goes east, back over the Jordan, into a wadi, one of those seasonal desert streams that runs hard in the winter and shrinks to a thread in the summer. And the ravens brought him bread and flesh in the morning, and bread and flesh in the evening, and he drank of the brook. Ravens, carrion birds. Under the law of Leviticus, unclean, that is the delivery service. And then the sentence that turns the passage, and it came to pass after a while, that the brook dried up, because there had been no rain in the land. The prophet who called down the drought is not exempt from it. He watches his own water go, day by day a little further down the stones, until the pools are warm and green and then gone. Whatever else this man is, he is not standing outside the judgment he announced. He is inside it, watching the wadi die. And then God sends him somewhere that should genuinely surprise you. Arise, get thee to Zarephath, which belongeth to Zidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain thee. Zarephath is on the coast, between Tyre and Sidon. It is Phoenician, it is not in Israel. It is, in the plainest possible terms, Jezebel's home country, the territory of the very people whose god Elijah has staked his life against. Ruled by the network of city kings that the Queen of Israel was born into, God takes the prophet of the drought out of Israel entirely and plants him inside the homeland of the opposition, in a coastal town, in the house of a starving woman. And she is starving. When he finds her, she is gathering 2 sticks. 2, she has a handful of meal in a barrel and a little oil in a cruse. And she is going to bake it, and she and her son are going to eat it, and then they are going to die. That is not despair as a figure of speech. That is a woman doing the arithmetic and reaching the end of it. He asks her for the food anyway, and he tells her the barrel will not empty and the cruse will not fail until the day rain returns. She does it, and it doesn't. And then the boy dies. There is no warning. His sickness was so sore that there was no breath left in him. And the woman turns on Elijah with a line that has more raw grief in it than almost anything else in the book. What have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? Art thou come unto me to call my sin to remembrance, and to slay my son? He does not answer her. He takes the boy. He carries him up to the loft where he has been sleeping, and he lays him on his own bed, and then he says something to God that is not reverent at all. Hast thou also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourn, by slaying her son? And then he stretches himself upon the child 3 times. The child breathes. I want to mark what just happened, because in the flow of the story it goes by fast. In the entire Hebrew Bible, from Genesis forward, nobody has ever come back from the dead before this moment. Not one person. This is the first. It happens in a rented upstairs room, in a foreign town, to an unnamed boy, in front of one witness, a Phoenician widow who has just lost everything twice in a week. She says, "Now by this I know that thou art a man of God," and there is the answer to the question I left open. Why Zarephath? Why send him there? Because before Elijah goes up on Mount Carmel and challenges the god of Tyre on a mountaintop in front of a nation, he is quietly sustained for years inside Tyre's own territory by a woman who worships that god's neighbours, and he raises her son. The confrontation on Carmel is not the first round. It is the second. The first one happened in a kitchen. Part 3. The God who could not be woken. 3 years later he walks back into Israel to end it, and he does it with a number. Send and gather to me all Israel unto Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal 450, and the prophets of the groves 400, which eat at Jezebel's table, 850 men, against one. On a limestone ridge running down from the Mediterranean toward the Jezreel Valley, Carmel, a green promontory in a brown country 24 miles of it, vineyards and olive groves on the seaward slopes, the plain spread out below. The traditional site of what happened next is a shoulder on the southeastern flank called El Muhraka, which means the burning, the place of sacrifice. And from it you can see the valley and, in the ravine underneath, the brook Kishon. He gives them the terms: 2 bulls, 2 altars, no fire. The God who answers by fire, let him be God. And then he lets them go first, and waits, and the whole day gets away from them. They call from morning until noon. They leap upon the altar. They cut themselves with knives and lancets till the blood gushed out. And nothing happens. No voice, no fire, nor any that answered. And at noon Elijah starts making fun of them. Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth and must be awaked. Now that line reads in English as ordinary sarcasm. It is probably not ordinary at all. And here is where the scholarship gets genuinely interesting. Jezebel was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. The chief god of Tyre, the god of her father's city, the god of the royal house she came from, was Melkart, whose name means king of the city. And a great many scholars, going back as far as Josephus in the 1st century, and argued in modern times by figures like H. Rowley and the Belgian scholar Corinne Bonnet, have identified the Baal that Jezebel brought into Israel specifically as this Melkart of Tyre. What makes that matter here is what Melkart was. He was a dying and rising god, and his cult had an annual festival called in Greek the Agursis, the Awakening. Josephus, quoting an earlier historian, records that King Hiram of Tyre was the first to celebrate the awakening of the god in a month falling at roughly the end of the winter rains. Sit with that for a moment. Elijah is standing on a mountain in the 3rd year of a drought, in front of the prophets of a god whose worshippers hold an annual ceremony to wake him up at the end of the rainy season. And he says, shout louder, maybe he's asleep and needs waking. I have to be careful here. This is a possible reading, not a proven one. The text of Kings never says Melkart. It speaks of Baal in the general sense, and of Asherah alongside him. Some scholars are confident about the connection, and some are not. But if it is right, That taunt is not a man being rude about a statue. It is a man standing in a drought, aiming a joke at a specific liturgy in front of the people who perform it. Then Elijah rebuilds the broken altar of the Lord with 12 stones, digs a trench around it, and has the whole thing drenched 3 times until the water fills the trench. And he prays a short prayer. It is 30-odd words. After a day of screaming and cutting, then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. Read the list again. Not just the offering. The stones, the dust, the water. The people fall on their faces. The prophets of Baal are taken down to the Kishon and killed. Elijah climbs to the top of Carmel, puts his face between his knees, and sends his servant to look at the sea 7 times until a cloud comes up the size of a man's hand, and the rain comes back. So the answer to the question that hung over this whole scene, what was he actually mocking, is this, not a statue. A specific claim about a specific God, made on the one day of the year when that claim was most vulnerable. He picked his ground, which makes what happens next almost impossible to understand. Part 4. The sound of a thin silence. The day after the greatest public victory in his life, Elijah sat down under a bush in the desert and asked God to kill him. That is not a devotional exaggeration. It is the text. Jezebel sends him a message, so let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And the man who faced 850 prophets on a mountain runs. He goes south, out of the kingdom, all the way to Beersheba, leaves his servant there, and walks another day into the wilderness alone. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. Then he lies down under a juniper tree and sleeps, and God's response is not a rebuke and not a sermon. An angel touches him and tells him to eat, a cake baked on hot stones, a jar of water by his head. He eats and sleeps again. The angel comes back and touches him a second time. Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. Then he walks for 40 days and 40 nights, to Horeb, the mount of God. Every one of those details is a quotation. 40 days and 40 nights is Moses on the mountain. Horeb is Sinai, the same mountain under its other name. The story has stopped being about Elijah for a moment and started rhyming, deliberately, with the oldest story Israel had, and it does not stop here. He goes into a cave. And God asks him a question. What dost thou here, Elijah? His answer is a complaint, and he will give exactly the same one twice. I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. I only am left. And God says, Go stand on the mountain. And a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. Notice what that last one is doing. This is the man who called fire down out of the sky the week before. Fire was the proof. Fire was the whole argument on Carmel. And now, on Horeb, God comes past in fire, and is not in it. And after the fire, 3 Hebrew words. Kol demama dakha. Kol is a sound or a voice, it is the ordinary word, and it can even mean thunder. Dakha means thin, fine, small, the word you would use of beaten dust or fine flour. And demama is the strange one. It means stillness, or calm, or silence. It appears almost nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, a handful of times, once in Job, once in a psalm about a storm going quiet, a sound of thin stillness, a voice of fine silence. Look at what translators have done with it. The King James gave us a still small voice, and that phrase went into the language so deeply that most English speakers use it without knowing where it came from. Other translations reach for a gentle whisper or a low whisper. The New Revised Standard Version refuses to soften it at all, a sound of sheer silence. Robert Alter gives us a sound of minute stillness. They are not disagreeing about the vocabulary, they are disagreeing about a paradox that is in the Hebrew itself. It is a noise made of quiet. Whatever it was, the text says that when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the mouth of the cave. And the voice asks him the same question, "What dost thou here, Elijah?" And he gives the identical complaint, word for word. I, even I only, am left. Here is the payoff, and it is not what people usually take from this scene. God does not tell him he is wrong to be afraid. God gives him 3 tasks and 1 correction. Anoint Hazael king over Syria, anoint Jehu king over Israel, and anoint Elisha to be prophet in thy room, 2 kings and a successor, the machinery that will outlive him. Then the correction, yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal. You are not the last one. You were never the last one. You just could not see them. So he goes down off the mountain and finds a man ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he does not say a word to him. He walks past and throws his cloak over him. The years that follow are the ones you probably know best. A vineyard in Jezreel that a man named Naboth refuses to sell, because ancestral land was not a commodity, and a queen who has him killed with forged letters and 2 hired witnesses, and a king who goes down to take possession and finds Elijah already standing in it. Hast thou found me, O mine enemy? In the place where dogs licked the blood of Naboth shall dogs lick thy blood. And later, on a hillside, messengers sent to consult a Philistine god about a dying king. Intercepted by a man the survivors could only describe one way, he was an hairy man, and girt with a girdle of leather about his loins. And he said, "It is Elijah the Tishbite." Remember that description. It comes back 800 years later, on a different man in a different wilderness. And then, with no warning at all, the Bible says this, and it came to pass, when the Lord would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. No transition. The story simply announces, in its opening clause, that this is the day. And that cloak, the one lying across a ploughman's shoulders in a field, is going to matter more than almost anything else in what follows. Keep your eye on it. Part 5. Gilgal, Bethel, Jericho, Jordan. The last day of Elijah's life on earth is a walk. And the route is not random. Gilgal, then Bethel. Then Jericho. Then the Jordan. 4 stops, and at every single one of them the same thing happens, 3 times over, in a rhythm the writer clearly wants you to feel. "Tarry here, I pray thee," says Elijah. And Elisha answers, "As the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee." Again at Bethel. Again at Jericho. 3 refusals in identical words, escalating with every mile. And the reader has already been told what is coming, so we are watching a younger man refuse to be sent away from something he can feel approaching and will not name. Now look at the geography, because it is doing work. Gilgal is where Israel first camped after crossing into the land under Joshua. Bethel is where Jacob dreamed of the ladder. Jericho is the first city that fell. And the Jordan is the boundary itself, the water Israel crossed to come in. And the walk goes down, from the hill country into the Great Rift, one of the lowest places on the face of the earth, through folded chalk badlands into thorn, scrub and dust, then Jericho with its palms and its spring, then out to the river. In high summer that valley is an oven. It is a descent backward through Israel's own memory, stop by stop, until they stand at the exact threshold the nation crossed to begin. Elijah is retracing the entry. In reverse, on his way out, and at every stop there are witnesses who already know. At Bethel, the sons of the prophets, the guild, the students, the prophetic community, come out to Elisha and say, "Knowest thou that the Lord will take away thy master from thy head today?" And Elisha's answer is one of the most human lines in the chapter. "Yea, I know it. Hold ye your peace. I know. Be quiet." The same exchange again at Jericho. Word for word. They know, they say it out loud, and he tells them to stop talking about it. Then the two of them go on to the river, and 50 men of the sons of the prophets follow at a distance and stand to watch. That detail matters, and we will need it shortly. 50 men, standing off, watching the riverbank, and Elijah took his mantle, and wrapped it together, and smote the waters, and they were divided hither and thither, so that they too went over on dry ground. The mantle. The same cloak he threw over a ploughman's shoulders in a field years earlier. He rolls it up, strikes the water, and the Jordan opens, and 2 men walk across the riverbed. You have seen this before. The sea opening under Moses' staff, the Jordan itself standing in a heap under the feet of the priests carrying the ark, at Gilgal, at the exact place they started walking from this morning. The story is not being subtle. It is putting Elijah's last act on the same shelf as Israel's founding miracles, and then walking him out of the land through the same gate the nation came in by. And on the far bank, on the wrong side of the river, outside the land, Elijah turns and asks a question. "Ask what I shall do for thee, before I be taken away from thee," which is the first time either of them has said out loud what is about to happen. And Elisha's answer is the most misunderstood sentence in this entire story. Part 6. The firstborn's share. "I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me." Almost everyone reading that in English hears the same thing. Give me twice what you had. Make me twice the prophet. And people notice, and preachers point out, that Elisha does go on to perform roughly twice as many recorded miracles as Elijah, and the whole thing gets tied up neatly. That is not what he asked for. The Hebrew is pishnayim, literally something like a mouth of 2, or a measure of 2. And it is not a vague expression. It is a technical legal term, and it appears in the law of inheritance in Deuteronomy, chapter 21, verse 17. The firstborn son receives pishnayim, a double portion, of everything the father leaves. What that means in practice, if a man had 3 sons, the estate was divided into 4 shares, and the firstborn took 2 of them, and each of the others took 1. He does not get twice the entire estate. He gets the heir's portion, the share that marks him as the principal successor, the one who assumes the father's place. So read Elisha's request again with that in your ear. He is not asking to be a greater prophet than his master. He is asking to be treated as the eldest son. He is asking for the succession. Let me be your heir, the one who inherits your office, your standing, your work. And the moment you see it, everything around it snaps into focus, because 2 verses later, when the whirlwind comes, what does Elisha shout? My father, my father. He has been asking for a family relationship the whole time, and this is a man with no father in the text, being asked for an inheritance by a man who left his own father standing in a field. And Elijah's response is careful. Thou hast asked a hard thing, nevertheless. If thou see me when I am taken from thee, it shall be so unto thee, but if not, it shall not be so. Why hard? Because it is not his to give. That is the point of the condition. Elijah cannot hand over the Spirit of God like a set of keys. He does not own it, and he cannot bequeath it. So he gives Elisha a sign instead, a condition he himself cannot control. If you see it, you have it. If you do not, you do not. Which means that on the last walk of Elijah's life, the succession of the prophetic office in Israel comes down to whether a man keeps his eyes open. That is a strange, sharp, and very old idea, and I think it is the reason the writer includes the detail that 50 other men were standing at a distance, watching the same riverbank. Because in a moment, something is going to happen out there, and only one of them is going to be recorded as having seen it. Part 7. What actually took him? And it came to pass, as they still went on and talked, that, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. I want to slow down because that is one verse, and there are at least 3 things in it that are not in the picture in your head. Start with the first clause. As they still went on and talked, they were walking. They were mid-conversation. Whatever this was, it arrived with no warning and no ceremony, no assembly, no altar, no crowd. 2 men on a riverbank, mid-sentence. Now the chariot. There appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder. Read what the chariot does. It parts them. The verb takes the 2 men as its object. It separates Elijah from Elisha. The chariot is not described as stopping, or waiting, or being boarded. Nobody climbs on. Nobody takes the reins. It comes between them, and that is the entire function the sentence gives it. It is a barrier. And then the last clause tells you in plain words what actually carried him. Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. The Hebrew is sa'ara, a storm wind, a tempest, the kind of violent whirling wind that shows up in Job and in Ezekiel's opening vision. It is not a vehicle you ride. It is weather. And the chapter has told you this already in its very first sentence. Before any of this happened, when the Lord would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind. So the text bookends the whole episode with the same word. The whirlwind takes him. The chariot separates him. I am not telling you the chariot is not there. It is there, and it is on fire, and so are the horses. I am telling you the Bible assigns it a different job than the one religious art has given it. In the picture we carry, the chariot is the elevator. In the verse it is the door closing. And what does Elisha do? And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. He saw it. The condition is met, the succession is secure, and the first thing out of his mouth is not a theological statement, it is a boy's cry. My father, and then a title, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. Chariots were the heavy weapon of the age. Ahab put thousands in the field. Elisha is looking at the empty air where his teacher was and calling him the entire armoured corps of the nation. And he saw him no more. Then, and he took hold of his own clothes and rent them in 2 pieces. That is the formal gesture of mourning. He tears his clothes for a man who did not die. He took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him. The cloak comes down. The same cloak that landed on his shoulders in a ploughed field. The same cloak that opened the river an hour ago. It falls out of the sky, and Elisha picks it up and walks back to the water and strikes it and says, Where is the Lord God of Elijah? And the Jordan opens a second time. The sons of the prophets watching from the far bank see it and say, The spirit of Elijah doth rest on Elisha. And then they say the thing that brings us all the way back to where we started. Behold now, there be with thy servants 50 strong men. Let them go, we pray thee, and seek thy master, lest peradventure the Spirit of the Lord hath taken him up, and cast him upon some mountain or into some valley. Let us go and look for the body. Elisha says no. They ask again and keep asking until the text says he was ashamed, until it became embarrassing to keep refusing, and he lets them go. They search 3 days. They find nothing. And they come back, and he says to them, Did I not say unto you, go not? Now, here is the answer to the question I opened with. Why does the Bible include that? Why report a fruitless 3-day search by 50 men after the miracle has already been witnessed and confirmed? Because it forecloses the alternative. The text goes out of its way to establish, with a search party and a time frame and a negative result, that there is no body, not a hidden grave, not an unmarked one, nothing to find. And so the ordinary sentence that the Hebrew Bible gives every single one of its great figures, he died and was buried and his grave is in such a place, is never written about this man. It cannot be. Moses got close. Moses dies on Nebo and God buries him, and the text says no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. An unknown grave, but there is a grave. Elijah does not even get that. And a story with no body is a story that cannot be closed, which is exactly what happens next, because the man who would not stay gone starts refusing to stay gone inside the Bible itself. Part 8. The letter that should not exist. Here is a problem that almost nobody in the pews has ever been told about, and it is sitting in plain sight in the book of 2 Chronicles. Jehoram, king of Judah, a bad king, married to a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, who came to the throne and murdered all 6 of his own brothers to secure it, receives a piece of mail. And there came a writing to him from Elijah the prophet, saying, Thus saith the Lord God of David thy father, Because thou hast not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat thy father, behold, with a great plague will the Lord smite thy people, and thy children and thy wives, and all thy goods. A letter. From Elijah. In writing. The difficulty is chronological, and it is straightforward. On the ordinary reading of the books of Kings, Elijah has already been taken up before Jehoram of Judah's reign gets going. 2 Kings chapter 2 happens, and then Elisha is the active prophet through the reign of Jehoshaphat's successors. So on the face of it, Elijah appears to be sending correspondence from after his own ascension. Now I want to be honest about how this is handled, because there is a range, and the honest thing is to lay it out, rather than pick one and pretend the matter is settled. The oldest traditional solution is that he wrote it in advance. The medieval Jewish commentator David Kimchi, known as Radak, argued that Elijah foresaw prophetically what Jehoram would become, and wrote the letter before he was taken, leaving it to be delivered at the right moment, possibly by Elisha. On that reading there is no problem at all, there is only a delayed delivery. A second solution says the chronology in Kings is not as tight as it looks. The regnal years of Israel and Judah in this period are genuinely tangled, overlapping co-regencies, 2 different kings named Jehoram reigning at once in the 2 kingdoms. On this view, Elijah may still have been alive early in Jehoram's reign, and the placement of chapter 2 is thematic rather than strictly sequential. The third solution is the one you will find in most critical commentaries, and it is that the letter is the chronicler's own composition, a literary and theological device, rather than a preserved document. The chronicler is writing centuries later, with his own concerns, and the effect of the letter is to bring the great northern prophet's voice to bear in judgment on a southern king who married into the northern royal house. The verdicts in the older critical literature are blunt about it. One standard commentary calls it a product of the imagination, another calls it legendary, another apocryphal. I am not going to tell you which of those is right. The chronological difficulty is real, the proposed solutions are real, and people who have spent their lives on this text disagree about it. That is simply the state of the question. But whichever explanation you find most persuasive, notice the shape of what is happening in the tradition. Barely a page after the Bible establishes that this man has no body and no grave, his voice turns up again in a document addressed to a king in a different kingdom in a later generation. He is already coming back. And the promise that he will has not even been written yet. Part 9. The last words of the Old Testament. Open a Christian Bible. Find the place where the Old Testament stops and the New Testament begins, that page where Malachi ends and Matthew starts. Now read backward 2 verses. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. That is it. That is the last thing the Old Testament says. 400 years of silence on the traditional reckoning, and then the Gospels. And the final sentence before that silence is a promise that a specific man is coming back. Most people never notice the placement. It is invisible precisely because it is structural. The last words of a testament, sitting exactly where you would put a hinge. Malachi set it up a chapter earlier. Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. Now the messenger gets a name. But here is where it gets more interesting, and where you need to know that your Bible is arranged differently than the Hebrew one. In the Hebrew Bible, the verse numbering is different. What your English Bible calls Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, is Malachi chapter 3, verses 23 and 24 in Hebrew. More importantly, the Hebrew canon does not end with Malachi at all. It ends with Chronicles. So this passage is not the last word of the Jewish scriptures, it is the end of the prophetic collection, which is a different kind of ending. That difference in arrangement is not a conspiracy or a suppression, it is just 2 traditions ordering the same books differently, and each ordering produces its own effect. But the Christian ordering is doing something deliberate, and it works. It makes the Old Testament end on a name and an unfulfilled promise, pointed straight at the page that follows. Now the last word of the passage, which is the part almost no English reader can see. Lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. That word, curse, is the Hebrew sherem. It is not a mild word. It is not bad luck or divine disapproval. Sherem is the ban, the term used for something devoted to destruction, set apart for annihilation. It is the word used of Jericho. It is one of the heaviest words in the language, and the Hebrew Bible ends its prophetic collection on it. That was felt, very early, to be an unbearable way to finish. So there is a practice in Jewish liturgical reading, and it is still done, that when this passage is read aloud in the synagogue, after the final verse the reader goes back and repeats verse 5, Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet. So the reading does not end on cherem, it ends on the promise. There is something almost unbearably human about that. A community over centuries deciding that a book will not be allowed to end on the word for annihilation, and choosing instead to end it every time on a man who is coming back. Which means that by the time we reach the 1st century, the situation is this. There is a man in the national memory who left without dying, whose body was searched for and never found. And there is a text, read publicly, repeatedly, in a form deliberately arranged to end on it, that says he is coming back before the day of the Lord. The question is, what people actually did with that? And the popular answer to that question is, I have to tell you, considerably overstated. Part 10. What Ben Sira knew and what he did not. Around 180 years before Christ, a Jerusalem sage named Yeshua Ben Sira wrote a long book of wisdom, and in the back of it he put a hymn in praise of Israel's great men. When he reaches Elijah, he he writes this: "Then arose Elijah the prophet like a fire, and his word burned like a torch. And a few lines later, you were taken up by a whirlwind of fire, in a chariot with horses of fire." First, be clear what this book is. Sirach, also called Ecclesiasticus, is in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, and not in Protestant ones. It sits in the category the Reformation called apocryphal and Catholic tradition calls deuterocanonical. Whatever your tradition does with it, here it is something better than a proof text. It is a dated snapshot of what an educated, pious Jew in Jerusalem believed about Elijah 2 centuries before the Gospels. And look what has already happened. Ben Sira has fused them. The whirlwind and the chariot have merged into a single image of fiery ascent, the exact compression that lives in your head and in every stained glass window. Within a few centuries of the text, the picture has already tightened. But the line that matters most comes next. "You who are ready at the appointed time, it is written, to calm the wrath of God before it breaks out in fury, to turn the heart of the father to the son, and to restore the tribes of Jacob, ready at the appointed time." And that middle phrase is a direct quotation of Malachi. That is, as far as we can date anything, the first clear statement outside the Bible that Elijah is not merely gone, but held in reserve. Waiting, assigned a future job. Now Josephus, writing after the fall of Jerusalem, and what interests me is how careful he is. He writes that at that time Elijah disappeared from among men, and that to this day nobody knows anything of his death. And then, that concerning Elijah, and concerning Enoch who lived before the flood, it is written in the sacred books that they disappeared, but so that nobody knew that they died. Read what he leaves out. No whirlwind, no chariot, no horses of fire. Josephus knows this text perfectly well, and he chooses the word disappeared and repeats it and brackets Elijah with Enoch under the same careful formula. He was writing for a Greek and Roman readership steeped in stories of heroes taken up to the gods. And he may be declining to make a claim that would sound like ordinary pagan apotheosis. Whatever his reason, he handles the ascension with tongs. So here is where I have to correct something you have almost certainly heard, and it may be the single most useful thing in this entire episode. You will very often be told that every Jew in the 1st century expected Elijah to return as the forerunner of the Messiah, that this was the universal, settled background assumption of the whole culture, so that when John the Baptist appeared, everyone was primed for it. That was, for a long time, the standard scholarly position too. You can find it in the major mid-century works. It has been seriously challenged, and it has not recovered. In 1981, a scholar named Morris Firestein went back through the primary sources one by one and concluded that the expectation of Elijah specifically as the forerunner of the Messiah is not widely attested in the Jewish literature of the period at all. 4 years later, Joseph Fitzmyer, one of the most respected Catholic biblical scholars of his generation, published a follow-up and broadly agreed. And they raised a genuinely uncomfortable possibility that the idea of Elijah as forerunner of the Messiah may be, in part, a Christian development read backward into Judaism. Others have pushed back hard. Dale Allison and Chaim Milikowski have argued that the sentence in Mark's Gospel, "The scribes say that Elijah must first come," is itself evidence that somebody in the 1st century believed it, because otherwise the disciples would not be quoting it as an established teaching. And underneath all of that sits an even more basic question. Read Malachi again, plainly. "He shall come before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." Before the Lord. The text does not say before the Messiah. Whether Elijah was expected as the herald of God's own day of judgment, or as the herald of a messianic figure, is a real distinction, and it is exactly the point at issue. So let me state it as cleanly as I can. The idea that Elijah is coming back is old, solid and well attested. It is in Malachi, it is in Ben Sira, it is in the liturgy. The claim that first century Judaism universally expected him as the Messiah's personal forerunner is contested, probably overstated, and should not be repeated as settled fact. That is the honest ground. And it is the ground on which the New Testament makes its move. Part 11. The two men on the mountain. 6 days after telling his disciples that some of them would not taste death before they saw the kingdom, Jesus takes 3 of them up a high mountain, and something happens to his appearance. The Greek word Matthew and Mark use is metamorphoth, he was transformed. It is the passive of metamorpho, and it is the root of the English word metamorphosis. His face shone as the sun, Matthew says, and his raiment was white as the light. Mark, more concretely, says his clothes became whiter than any launderer on earth could bleach them. And, behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias talking with him. Stop there for a second, because the guest list is not random. Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, that is the standard reading, and it is correct as far as it goes. But look at what else these two men have in common, and nobody else in the Hebrew scriptures does. Moses died on a mountain in Moab, and God buried him, and no man knows the place of his grave to this day. Elijah did not die at all, and 50 men searched for 3 days and found nothing. The 2 figures who appear on that mountain are the 2 figures in all of Israel's story whose bodies are unaccounted for, the one with an unknown grave and the one with no grave. And Luke, only Luke, tells us what they were talking about. They spake of his decease, which he should accomplish at Jerusalem. The word behind decease is exodos, and that is an extraordinary choice, because it is carrying at least 3 things at once. First, it is a known Greek euphemism for death, a going out, a departure from life. Peter uses it that way in his own letter when he talks about his coming death. Second, and unmistakably for anyone who knew the Greek scriptures, it is the title of the book. Exodus is the going out from Egypt. So Moses, the man who led the first one, is standing on a mountain discussing an exodus that is going to be accomplished at Jerusalem. And third, in the plainest sense, it means a departure, a leaving, which is precisely what one of the 2 men beside him did in a whirlwind on the far side of the Jordan. Peter, in the way of a man who needs to be doing something, proposes building 3 shelters. Mark adds the merciless editorial note, for he wist not what to say, for they were sore afraid. A cloud covers them, and a voice says, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." And then it is over, and they are walking back down the mountain, and the disciples ask the question that has been sitting there the whole time. Why then say the scribes that Elias must first come? They have just watched Elijah stand on a mountaintop and leave again, and their question is not awe, it is textual. Wait, the scribes teach that Elijah comes first. What was that? And the answer Jesus gives them takes us into the most delicate passage in this whole story. Part 12. The man who said, "I am not, Elias truly shall first come, and restore all things. But I say unto you, that Elias is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed." Then the disciples understood that he spake unto them of John the Baptist. That is Matthew's account, and it is about as direct as the Gospels get. And it is not the only place. Earlier, speaking about John, Jesus says, "And if you will receive it, this is Elias," which was for to come. Notice the conditional, "if you will receive it." That is not an incidental verbal tick. Jesus attaches a qualification to the statement that he does not attach to most things he says. And go back further to the very beginning of Luke's Gospel, before John is even born. An angel tells his father Zechariah what the child will be, and the phrasing is exact. he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elias, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, in the spirit and power of, not he will be Elijah. And the mission statement is a direct quotation of Malachi. So we have a set of texts identifying John the Baptist with the promised Elijah, and one of them is spoken by Jesus plainly, twice, and then there is the other passage. In John's Gospel chapter 1, the authorities in Jerusalem send priests and Levites out to the wilderness to interrogate John directly, and they run down a list. Who art thou? He confesses, I am not the Christ. And they asked him, What then? Art thou Elias? And he saith, I am not. Art thou that prophet? And he answered, No, 4 words in the Greek that could hardly be less ambiguous. The one man in the New Testament with the most authority to answer the question, the man himself, is asked point blank whether he is Elijah, and denies it. Now, I am not going to pretend that tension is not there, and I am not going to pretend the church has not thought about it for 2,000 years, because it has. The usual resolution, and it is a reasonable one, distinguishes function from identity. John denies being Elijah in the sense his question has meant. The literal Tishbite, the 9th century man himself, returned in person. To that question the honest answer is no. But he does come in the spirit and power of Elijah, exactly as the angel said. Doing the work Malachi assigned, the wilderness, the hair garment, the leather belt, the turning of hearts, function without identity. That is a coherent reading, and it may well be right. But here is what I owe you as a matter of straight dealing, and it is what the channel exists to do. The identification of John the Baptist as Elijah is presented in the Gospels as Jesus' interpretation. That is not a diminishment. In the framework of the New Testament, it is the highest possible authority for a reading, but it is, as the text itself presents it, an interpretive claim offered with a conditional, delivered to disciples who did not expect it, about a man who had already publicly denied it. The Gospels put both of those things on the page and do not harmonize them for you. Jesus says John is Elijah. John says he is not. I am not going to resolve for you what the text leaves standing. What I will point out is what this does to the promise, because whichever way you take it, notice that the New Testament does not treat Malachi as closed. Even after identifying John with the coming Elijah, Jesus says Elijah truly shall first come and restore all things. In the future tense, in the same breath. The question stays open in the Gospels themselves, and it stays open right to the last book of the Bible, where, I have to warn you, the thing everybody says about it is not actually in the text. Part 13. The witnesses who are never named. In the 11th chapter of Revelation, 2 figures appear, and I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. And then their credentials, these have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues, as often as they will. Power to shut heaven so that it does not rain. That is Elijah, it is the first thing he ever did. Power to turn water to blood and strike the earth with plagues. That is Moses, it is the first thing he ever did. And fire proceeds out of their mouths to devour their enemies, which is a hard thing not to hear as the 2 companies of 50 on the hillside. So it is Moses and Elijah, back for the last chapter of the story. Everyone knows that. Except the text never says so. Read the chapter. There is no name in it. Not Moses, not Elijah, not Enoch, not anyone. The 2 witnesses are unnamed from beginning to end. The identification of them as Moses and Elijah is an interpretation, a very old and very reasonable one, drawn from exactly the parallels I just listed. The earliest clear statement of it in Christian writing comes from Hilary of Poitiers in the 4th century, and it is not the only interpretation on offer, and never has been. A substantial ancient tradition names the two witnesses as Enoch and Elijah instead, the two men who never died, held back precisely because they never died, returning to finish, and then, finally, to be killed. I am not telling you the Moses and Elijah reading is wrong. I am telling you it is a reading, and that the difference between what a text says and what a tradition has concluded about it is the difference between solid ground and thin ice. And this channel is going to keep standing on the solid part. But there is one more Elijah moment in the New Testament, and unlike Revelation, it requires no interpretation at all, because it is a crowd reaction caught live. Golgotha, the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? And some of them that stood there, when they heard that, said, This man calleth for Elias. Eli, my God. It sounds to a bystander at a distance, in the noise like Eliyahu. And straightway one of them ran, and took a sponge, and filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink. The rest said, Let be, let us see whether Elias will come to save him. Think about what that reveals. Not a doctrine, not a scribal debate about forerunners, a reflex. A crowd at an execution hears a syllable that might be a name, and the instinct that comes out of them before thought is that Elijah might turn up and pull the man down off the cross. Whatever the scholars conclude about how formalized the expectation was, that is what it looked like on the street. He is the rescue that has not been ruled out. 9 centuries after 50 men gave up looking for his body, a crowd in Jerusalem stands and waits, out loud, to see whether he will come. He does not. And the story could have ended there, a promise that stayed unfulfilled, a name that faded. It did not. It went in a direction almost nobody expects, and it took a form you can still put your hands on. Part 14. The stones that remember Ahab. Before we get to the table and the empty cup, I want to take you somewhere quieter, because there is a question sitting under all of this that deserves a straight answer. Is any of the world of this story actually there? The prophet we cannot dig up, but he spends his life shouting at a specific king, in a specific kingdom, married to a specific foreign queen, in a specific century. And that, the world, the politics, the dynasty, turns out to be one of the better attested slices of the entire Hebrew Bible. Start in the British Museum, with a lump of grey stone about 7 feet high called the Kirk Monolith. It was set up by Shalmaneser III of Assyria, and it records his campaign west in the year 853 before Christ. A battle at a place called Karkar against a coalition of local kings who had banded together to stop him. The inscription lists the coalition, and on that list, in Assyrian cuneiform, carved by a scribe who had no interest whatsoever in the religious history of Israel, is Ahab, the Israelite. Not a later copy, not a Judean chronicle, an enemy's war monument, contemporary with the man, and the contribution credited to him is striking. Ahab is recorded as bringing 2,000 chariots, the largest chariot force of any king in the alliance. That number is debated. Some scholars argue it is a scribal error for 200, since the monument appears to have been carved in a hurry. What is not debated is that Ahab of Israel was there, and was a serious regional power. Here is the strange part. The Bible never mentions Karkar. Not once. The biblical writers are not interested in Ahab's foreign policy. They are interested in his wife and his altars. So we have an Assyrian king recording a battle the Bible ignores, and a Hebrew historian recording a drought the Assyrians ignore, and the two agree on the one thing they both had reason to know. Ahab ruled Israel, and he had an army. Then go to the Louvre and find the Mesha Stele, the Moabite stone. Black basalt, about a meter tall, carved on the orders of King Mesha of Moab, and it opens by describing how Omri, king of Israel, oppressed Moab for many days, and how Mesha's own reign threw the oppression off. Omri, Ahab's father, the founder of the dynasty, named in Moabite by a hostile neighbouring king, describing a real occupation across the Jordan. Then, from Tel Dan in the far north, a smashed basalt victory stele in Aramaic, put up by an Aramean king, probably Hazael of Damascus, one of the 3 men Elijah was told at Horeb to anoint. And then, Samaria itself. Omri bought the hill and built the capital, and the excavations found fine-dressed ashlar masonry in a Phoenician technique, exactly what a king with a Tyrian marriage alliance would import. The Book of Kings says Ahab built an ivory house. The excavators recovered a large assemblage of carved ivory plaques, Egyptian motifs worked in Phoenician style, sphinxes, palmettes, sacred trees, and the recurring image the scholars call the woman at the window. A century later, the prophet Amos would denounce the houses of ivory in Samaria. There is now a case of them in a museum. So, what does all of this actually prove? I want to be very careful, because this is precisely the point where it is easiest to overclaim, and overclaiming is how you lose people who are paying attention. It proves the world. Omri was real. Ahab was real. The northern kingdom was a genuine regional power with a chariot force and a Phoenician alliance and a luxury court, in exactly the century and exactly the political situation the Bible describes. Hazael was real. The Moabite conflict was real. When Kings tells you about the frame of Elijah's life, it is describing a world we can independently touch. It does not prove the ravens at the Wadi. It does not prove the jar of meal, or the boy on the bed in Zarephath, or the fire on Carmel, or the whirlwind at the Jordan. Archaeology cannot speak to those, and never will. A spade can tell you that the king Elijah shouted at genuinely sat on a throne in Samaria. It cannot tell you what came down on a mountain, and any honest person handling this material has to say so. What it does mean is that this is not a story set in a fog. It has a flaw under it. And when you read about a prophet in a hair cloak walking into a palace built of imported ashlar, furnished with Phoenician ivory, to confront a king whose army the Assyrians took seriously, you are not reading about nowhere. You are reading about a place that leaves fragments in museum drawers. Part 15. The Cup Nobody Drinks. Now come forward almost 3,000 years into a dining room on a spring evening, a Passover seder, a table, a book at every place, candles. Over the course of the night, everyone drinks 4 cups of wine, each marking a stage of the telling. 4 is the number. It is fixed. It goes back to the earliest rabbinic sources. And then there is another cup. It is usually the finest thing on the table, often silver, often the most ornate object in the house. It gets filled with wine. And nobody drinks it. It sits there through the whole meal, full, in the middle of the table, and everyone knows whose it is. The cup of Elijah. Ask most people where that comes from, and you will hear that it is an ancient sign of hospitality, a place kept for the prophet in case he comes tonight. The real answer is more recent, considerably stranger, and I think much better. It comes from an argument about wine that was never settled. In the Talmud's tractate on Passover there is a discussion of the cups and where in the service they fall, and in the manuscripts there is a variant. Some versions say that over the 4th cup one completes the Hallel, others say the 5th. A single word, differing between copies. That is enough to create a genuine problem in Jewish law, because the question is not academic. It is what you should actually do at the table, and the medieval authorities divided. Rashi held there was no 5th cup. Maimonides treated it as optional. The Ravad held one ought to drink it. Serious authorities, honestly disagreeing with no way to settle it. So the practice that developed was a compromise of exquisite delicacy. You pour the 5th cup, honouring those who say it is required, and you do not drink it, honouring those who say it is forbidden. And now the second piece falls into place. In rabbinic literature, when a legal dispute cannot be resolved, the discussion is closed with an Aramaic word, teku. It means, roughly, let it stand, the question remains standing, and there is a traditional reading of that word as an acronym, standing for a Hebrew phrase meaning, the Tishbite will resolve questions and difficulties. The Tishbite. Elijah, when he comes, he will settle what we could not. So, here is a cup on the table that exists because of a dispute nobody could resolve. And unresolved disputes belong to Elijah. The cup is his because the argument is his. How late is this? Later than almost anyone assumes. The earliest identified mention comes from a 15th century rabbi, Zelikman Binger, and his description is wonderfully candid. He has seen people on Passover night pour an extra cup and set it on the table, saying it is the cup of Elijah the prophet, and he adds, in effect, I do not know the reason for this. A rabbi in the 15th century watching a custom appear in his own lifetime, writing down that he does not know where it came from. As a physical object, the special ornate cup of Elijah cannot be traced earlier than the 16th century. The same is true of the other great Elijah moment of the Seder, the opening of the door in Ashkenazi practice. The door of the house is opened, and a short passage of verses is recited, beginning Shafok Kamatka, pour out thy wrath upon the nations that have not known thee. It is stitched together from Psalms and from Lamentations. And it is not in the Talmud. It is not in the works of the Geonim. It is not in Rashi. It is not in Maimonides. Sephardic communities recite a shorter form. Yemenite communities do not recite it at all. Its earliest appearance is in the Maxor Vitri from the school of Rashi in the early 12th century, and a number of scholars have argued that it emerged as a response to the massacres of the Rhineland Jewish communities during the First Crusade in 1096. And the custom of opening the door while it is said is attributed to a 15th century rabbi, Israel Brunner. The reason given is Passover as Leil Shimurim, a night of watching, a night of protection, from the book of Exodus. You open the door on the night of watching because you are not afraid, and because you are still expecting somebody. I want to be clear about why I am telling you the dates, because someone will hear all this and conclude the tradition is diminished, that if the cup is medieval and the door is medieval, they are somehow less real. I would say the opposite, and I would say it strongly. What we can actually watch happening here is a community under real pressure in real centuries, taking an unfinished promise out of an ancient book and building a physical object out of it. A poured cup, an opened door, a settled argument left deliberately unsettled with the wine standing in it. That is not a diluted tradition. That is a tradition being made in front of us in documents we can date. Part 16. The empty chair. There is one more piece of furniture. At a Jewish circumcision, a Brit Milah, on the 8th day, a chair is set out. Often carved, often the best chair available, sometimes a permanent fixture in a synagogue kept for this purpose, and nothing else. And nobody sits in it. The child is placed on it for a moment, and the mohel says aloud, "This is the chair of Elijah." Kisei Shel Eliyahu. The chair of Elijah. It is prescribed in the great 16th century code of Jewish law, and reinforced in the mystical literature, and it is done to this day. Why him? Go back to Malachi, one chapter before the promise we read earlier. Behold, I will send my messenger, even the messenger of the covenant. That title, the messenger of the covenant, attached itself to Elijah, and circumcision is, in Hebrew, the covenant. So the zealot of the covenant is invited, formally, by furniture, to every one of them. And there is an older layer under it. Remember his complaint at Horeb, twice in identical words. The children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, and I, even I only, am left. He said it twice. The whole nation has abandoned the covenant, and I am the only one who has not. And the tradition's answer, worked out over centuries and expressed as a chair, is roughly this: then you will be at every single one, every 8th day, in every generation, in every country. Come and see whether you are the only one left. I find that one of the gentlest arguments anyone has ever made with a dead man, and at the end of every week, when the Sabbath goes out with the braided candle and the spices, one of the things traditionally sung is a short hymn, Eliyahu Hanavi. Elijah the prophet, Elijah the Tishbite, Elijah of Gilead, may he come speedily in our days. Elijah of Gilead. The same phrase from that broken half-line in 1 Kings, the one the scholars cannot pin down, sung in kitchens every week for centuries by people with no idea there was ever a question about it. So count what is standing empty. A cup filled at the table where the year turns, a chair at the beginning of a life, and a door opened onto the night once a year, deliberately, 3 open invitations in 3 different rooms for a man last seen going up in a windstorm on the far bank of the Jordan somewhere around the middle of the 9th century before Christ. And I want to end where the text ends, which is not with any of that, but with the plainest fact in this entire story. The Bible never says he died. It says Abraham died in a good old age and was gathered to his people. It says Moses died in the land of Moab, and God buried him, and no man knows his grave to this day. It says of king after king that he slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. That sentence is the Bible's way of closing a life, and it uses it constantly. It is never written about Elijah. Not once. Instead, there is a walk down to the river, a rolled-up cloak, water opening, a conversation interrupted, fire between 2 men, and a windstorm, and then a cloak lying on the ground with nobody in it, and 50 men searching 3 days and coming back with nothing. The story has no body in it, and a story with no body is a story that cannot be finished. That is why a legal argument about wine became a cup with his name on it, why a chair sits empty at the beginning of a life, why a crowd at an execution stopped and listened to see if he was coming. Not because anyone insisted on it, because the text left a door open and nobody has ever found a way to close it. Which brings us to the other one, because there is a second name on that very short list, a man 4 generations from Adam, who does not get a death notice either. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Half a verse. No whirlwind, no chariot, no witness, no search party. And unlike Elijah, an entire library grew up around his name, a book that describes what he saw when he was taken, that was quoted in the New Testament, that vanished from the Western Church for over 1,000 years, and that was found again, intact, in the mountains of Ethiopia. That is where this story goes next. Until then, thank you for walking this one through with me. Sleep well.